Theodore Keating had ridden through enough dust and heartbreak to last 3 lifetimes, and he was only 26 years old when the night he rode out of Caldwell, Kansas, under a sky so black it looked like God had forgotten to light the stars. He realized with a cold, sinking certainty that the woman he was looking for might not exist at all. It had started with a letter. That was the thing about 1882 in the Kansas Territory. A man could receive a piece of paper that changed the entire direction of his life. And by the time he figured out the paper had sent him the wrong way, he had already lost everything he thought he was riding toward. The letter had come to him through his friend Burl Dawson, a cattle broker out of Wichita who claimed to know a woman worth knowing. Her name, Burl said, was Clara Voss, and she was the finest woman between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains. She was looking for a good man, Burl had written, and Theodore, you are the best man I know. Theodore had been fool enough to believe it. He had packed his saddlebags, kissed the dry Kansas earth goodbye, and set off toward Wichita expecting to find a woman waiting with kind eyes and steady hands. What he found instead was Burl Dawson standing on the porch of his broker's office, hat in hand, wearing the specific expression of a man who had done something he could not easily explain. Clara Voss, Burl said slowly, left for Dodge City about 3 weeks ago. Theodore had stood in the afternoon heat and said nothing for a long moment. The dust from the trail was still settling around his horse's hooves. His back ached from 2 days of riding. His canteen was nearly empty. Then I'll go to Dodge City, Theodore said, because he was the kind of man who finished what he started. Dodge City did not have Clara Voss either. The woman at the boarding house there, a stout widow named Mrs. Halbrook, who seemed to know everyone's business within a 50-mile radius, told him that Clara had moved on to Medicine Lodge after a brief and apparently disastrous courtship with a cattle hand named Prentice who turned out to already have a wife in Missouri. Terrible situation, Mrs. Halbrook said with the satisfied tone of someone who had watched the terrible situation unfold from a front row seat. The poor girl was devastated. Theodore rode to Medicine Lodge. By the time he arrived, his bay horse Cutter was favoring his left rear leg slightly, and Theodore's patience was worn down to something thin and frayed. In Medicine Lodge, he was told, Clara Voss had gone to Pratt County to stay with a cousin. In Pratt County, he was told she had moved on to Barber County. In Barber County, at a dusty general store where a man with one eye sold him jerky and warm coffee, he was told that Clara Voss had recently married a farmer named Edsel Greer and was living quite contentedly somewhere in the hills of Comanche County. Theodore sat on the steps of that general store for a long time, eating his jerky, watching the road, thinking about the specific nature of bad luck. He was not heartbroken over Clara Voss. He had never met the woman. What broke something inside him that afternoon was the realization that he had been chasing a stranger through 6 counties for going on 4 weeks, sleeping on hard ground and in worse boarding houses, eating food that tasted like grief, all because he had let himself believe that somewhere out there was a person who was meant for him, and that he simply had to ride far enough to find her. The sky turned orange over Comanche County, and Theodore Keating decided to go home. Home was Clearwater, Kansas, a small settlement about 20 miles south of Wichita that sat along the Arkansas River like something that had been dropped there by accident and had never quite gotten around to leaving. It was not a glamorous place. It had 2 streets of packed dirt, a blacksmith operated by a man named Old Pete Hollies, who was in fact not particularly old but had gone gray at 22 and never recovered socially from the distinction, a dry goods store, a church that doubled as a school 3 days a week, a saloon that was a little nicer than it had any right to be, and about 40 families scattered across the surrounding plains like seeds thrown by an uncertain hand. Theodore's farm sat on the eastern edge of town, 40 acres of decent land that had been his father's and his father's father's before that. He grew winter wheat and kept a small herd of cattle, enough to live on and a little more. It was a quiet life, and he had never thought it was missing anything until Burl Dawson's letter arrived and made him feel like he was standing on one side of a river watching someone else's warmth from across the water. He rode into Clearwater on a Tuesday evening in late October of 1882, when the cottonwood trees along the river had gone gold, and the air had the sharp, clean smell of approaching winter. Cutter's hooves made their familiar sound on the packed dirt of the main street, and Theodore felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for weeks. The blacksmith's forge was still glowing even at this hour. The light from the saloon spilled yellow across the street. A dog he recognized, a big brown hound belonging to the Whitmore family, came trotting out to investigate and then apparently decided he was not interesting enough and trotted back. He was riding past the dry goods store, thinking about whether he had enough coffee at home or whether he would need to stop in before it closed, when someone stepped off the porch of the store carrying an armload of parcels so large it was a genuine mystery how they were staying upright. The top parcel was a bolt of calico cloth, red and white, which was balanced with the specific precariousness of something about to fall. Theodore pulled Cutter to a stop. "Do you need a hand with that?" he called down. The bolt of calico shifted. A face appeared around the side of it, and then the bolt fell anyway, unrolling across the porch steps in a long red and white river. "Oh, blast it," said Mae Fairchild. Theodore swung down from Cutter and tied him to the post and picked up the bolt of cloth before it could roll completely into the dirt. Mae Fairchild was already crouching on the steps gathering the other fallen parcels, her dark hair coming loose from its pin and falling across her cheek in a way that she seemed entirely unaware of. She was wearing a brown wool dress and her hands were capable and quick, reassembling the stack of parcels with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. "I had it," she said, standing up with the reconstructed stack, "until I did not have it." "That seems to be how it goes," Theodore said, handing her the bolt of calico. She looked at him then, really looked, the way a person does when they are trying to place someone they half recognize. Mae Fairchild was 23 years old and had lived in Clearwater her entire life, same as Theodore, and they had been neighbors in the specific way of small settlements where everyone knows everyone, but not everyone truly knows anyone. She had moved into the house that shared a fence line with his property when she was 8 years old, after her father Josiah Fairchild bought the adjacent land. For 15 years they had been neighbors and friendly acquaintances and nothing more, which Theodore now looked back on as one of the more significant failures of his general awareness. "Theodore Keating," she said, "you look terrible." "I have been riding for 4 weeks," he said. "Where did you go?" "Everywhere," he said, "that I should not have gone." She studied him for another moment with her direct, brown eyes. Mae Fairchild had always had eyes like that, the kind that took in exactly what was in front of them without adding things that were not there or subtracting things that were. It was a quality Theodore had not particularly appreciated before now, standing in the October dusk with trail dust on his boots and a dawning awareness of how foolish he had been for the better part of a month. "Well," she said, resettling the parcels in her arms, "I am glad you are home." It was a simple, neighborly thing to say, and she said it simply and neighborly, and walked to her wagon and loaded the parcels in and drove away. Theodore stood on the porch of the dry goods store watching her go and feeling something strange and new beginning to turn over in his chest like a field being broken for the first time in a long while. He went home. He put Cutter in the barn and tended the horse's slightly tender leg, which had been nursed through 4 weeks of careful riding and needed rest more than anything else. He went into his house, which smelled of cold fireplace and absence, and built a fire and heated what was left of some beans he had not thought to throw out before he left, which had not improved in his absence, and he sat at his kitchen table in the firelight and thought about Mae Fairchild. She had grown up next door to him. He had watched her go from a girl who chased chickens around her father's yard to a young woman who had helped her father run the farm after her mother, Mae Fairchild, died of a fever the winter Mae turned 16. He knew she could drive a wagon and mend a fence and bake bread that was better than any bread the town had ever produced. He knew she sang to herself sometimes when she was working in the yard, not loud but not quiet either, like someone who had decided the world could either hear it or not. He knew she had turned down at least 2 offers of marriage. He had heard about them at the general store in the way you heard about everything in Clearwater, and that both men who had offered had done so with the slightly stunned expressions of people who had not expected to be told no. He had known all of this for years, and had somehow never looked at it properly. He sat there in front of his fire until it burned low and he had to add more wood, and then he sat there some more, and by the time he went to bed, he had concluded nothing definitive except that he was very tired, and that Mae Fairchild had said she was glad he was home, and that this was worth more to him than 6 counties of writing had produced. The next morning was a Wednesday, and Theodore woke early as he always did and went out to tend his livestock in the blue-gray light before sunrise. The October air was cold enough that his breath came out in small white clouds. He could hear the river in the distance, steady and low. From somewhere on the other side of the fence, he could hear the sound of an axe, which meant that his neighbor was also up before sunrise and splitting wood. He finished his morning work, went inside, and cooked eggs and the coffee he had had enough of after all. He sat at the table with his coffee and his eggs, and the October light coming through the single east-facing window, and thought, with the clarity that a night of sleep can sometimes bring to problems that were murky the evening before, that there was no good reason why he should not speak to Mae Fairchild properly. He also thought, with the honesty that same clear morning light can provide whether you want it to or not, that he had no particular reason to believe Mae Fairchild had any interest in being spoken to by him in the manner he was now contemplating. They had been neighbors for 15 years, and he had never given her any reason to think of him as anything other than the young man on the other side of the fence, who sometimes helped with heavy lifting when her father asked. This was not an encouraging situation. But Theodore Keating had just ridden through 6 counties in pursuit of a woman he had never met based on nothing more than a second-hand recommendation, which meant that his capacity for optimism, however battered, was not entirely extinguished. He decided to take his fence-mending tools and go work on the section of fence along the shared property line that had been sagging since before he left. It needed to be done regardless. If Mae happened to be working on her side at the same time, that was simply the practical reality of 2 people who shared a fence line. He was out there by mid-morning with his tools, and the fence was in worse shape than he remembered. 3 posts leaning at angles that suggested the posts had given up trying to stand vertical and were now simply providing guidance in a general upward direction. He dug the first post out and started the work of resetting it in fresh-packed earth, and he had been at it perhaps half an hour when he heard footsteps in the dry grass on the other side of the fence. Mae Fairchild came through the gap where the fence was worst, and she was carrying a bucket of water from which, upon inspection, she produced a ladle. "You look thirsty," she said. "I am," he said, and took the ladle and drank. She set the bucket down on the ground and looked at the fence with the appraising eye of someone who knew what she was looking at. Her hair was pinned up today more securely than the night before, and she was wearing a dark blue apron over a gray dress, and she had apparently been doing something that involved flour because there was a small smear of it on her left cheek that she had not noticed. "That center post is completely rotten at the base," she said. "I noticed it in August. I meant to mention it, but then you were gone. I noticed it before I left and meant to fix it before I went," he said, "and then I went." "Where were you exactly?" she asked. Not prying, just asking, the way she asked things directly, as if she expected a direct answer and would actually listen to it. So he told her. He told her about Burl Dawson's letter and Clara Voss, and the 6 counties he had ridden through chasing a woman who turned out to be happily married to a farmer named Edsel Greer in Comanche County. He told it plainly, without adding flourishes that would make himself seem more sympathetic or subtracting details that made him seem less wise, because something about Mae Fairchild made him feel that plain truthfulness was the correct register. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "That is a very long way to ride for someone else's wife," she said. "She was not his wife yet when I started," Theodore said. "At least I do not think she was." Still, he agreed. Mae picked up the bucket and the ladle, but she did not immediately go back through the gap in the fence. She stood there a moment looking at the fence line in the way she had, thoughtfully, as if the fence were a problem she was working out in her mind, even though she did not own the fence and it was not technically her problem. "I will help you reset these posts if you like," she said. "I have nothing that cannot wait an hour." "You do not need to do that," he said. "I know I do not need to," she said. "I am offering." He looked at her, the flower on her cheek, the straightforward quality of her eyes, the bucket in her hand. "I would be glad of the help," he said. They worked on the fence together for 2 hours. She did not do it for show, she genuinely knew how to set a fence post, which said something about what her life had required of her since her mother died and her father's health had slowly begun to fail. Josiah Fairchild was still alive and living in a room at the back of the house, tended by me, but he had not been well enough to work the farm himself for going on 3 years now. Me ran it with the help of a hired man named Garrett who came 3 days a week, and she did the rest herself. Theodore knew this the way you know things about your neighbors, peripherally, incompletely, but working beside her for 2 hours in the October cold gave him a different kind of knowing. She worked without complaining and without pretending the work was easy. She knew when to hand him the tamping bar and when to hold the post, and when to simply step back and let him finish. When his hands got cold enough that he fumbled a nail, she handed him a spare without comment. By the time the last post was set and the fence line was standing properly again, the morning had become noon, and the sun was warm enough that they had both shed their outer layers. Mae's hair had come partly loose again in the manner that seemed to be its natural inclination. Theodore was aware that he was looking at her more than was strictly required by the work at hand. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for the company," she said. "It gets quiet out here." She said it matter-of-factly, not with self-pity, but it landed in his chest with a weight he had not been expecting. He thought about what it meant to run a farm mostly alone, while your father lay in the back room and the days came and went without much variation, and he thought about how he had spent 4 weeks riding through the Kansas territory in search of a stranger while this woman on the other side of his fence was right here. "Me," he said. She was gathering the tools to carry back through the fence gap. She stopped and looked at him. "Would you have supper with me Friday evening?" he asked. He asked it simply and directly the way he would have wanted to be asked something, because he had concluded that there was no sensible way to approach Mae Fairchild except head-on. "I am not the best cook in Clearwater, but I am not the worst, and I would like the company." She studied him the way she had the night before, with those direct brown eyes that did not add or subtract. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She went back through the fence gap with the tools, and he stood in the repaired fence line watching her cross the dry grass toward her farmhouse and thinking that "all right" were the 2 best words he had heard in 4 weeks. Thursday passed with the specific agonizing slowness that the day before an anticipated event is contractually obligated to pass, and Theodore spent it doing useful work, cleaning the house, which had developed the slightly melancholy quality of a house that has been empty for a month, patching a spot on the roof where he could see light that he definitely should not be able to see, and riding into town to buy provisions at the dry goods store. The woman who ran the store, Mrs. Cade, a sharp-eyed woman who had strong opinions about everything and kept them mostly to herself, but occasionally could not help herself, watched him select a slightly better than usual cut of bacon and a jar of preserved peaches and said, "Company coming, Theodore." "Just getting back to rights," he said. "Of course," said Mrs. Cade, with a tone that communicated she knew exactly what he was doing with the preserved peaches. He also spent Thursday afternoon going through the mental catalog of everything he knew about Mae Fairchild, and trying to determine whether any of it suggested that his hope was entirely unfounded. He knew she had turned down 2 offers of marriage, and he tried to think about who those men had been. One had been a merchant out of Wichita named Holt who had come down to Clearwater on business and apparently been taken with me during a church social. The other had been a young farmer named Dawes who had the next property over from the Fairchilds on the west side. Both were perfectly decent men by general account, and Mae had told them both no. He did not know why she had said no. He only knew that she had, and that she had kept running her farm and singing to herself while doing it, and that she had not seemed broken or incomplete about it. On Friday evening at 6 o'clock, Theodore had his kitchen fire going well, the bacon frying in the cast iron pan, with some potatoes he had dug from his garden that were honestly not too bad considering the season, and the preserved peaches set out as the nearest thing to a dessert he could manage. He had put on his good shirt, which was not that different from his regular shirt except that it did not have the frayed left cuff, and he had combed his hair, and he had set the table with his 2 matching plates that had belonged to his mother and were the best thing in the house. Mae arrived at 6, coming around the side of the house rather than the front because the most direct route from her farm to his was through the fence gap that was now repaired, and she came through the repaired gate with something covered in a cloth in her hands. "I brought corn bread," she said. "I hope that is all right. I cannot come to someone's table empty-handed." "That is more than all right," he said, and held the door for her. She stepped inside and looked around his kitchen with uncomplicated interest, not judging it, just seeing it, noting the things that were there and the things that were not. It was a bachelor's kitchen, functional and a little sparse, with the marks of a man who had learned to take care of himself without anyone teaching him how to care for a space rather than just inhabit it. She said nothing about any of that, just set the corn bread on the table and took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the door. She was wearing a dark green dress he had not seen before, or perhaps had seen and not registered, with a small white collar. She looked the way she always looked, which was to say like herself, and Theodore decided that this was a quality he valued above most others. They ate supper together, and it was the best evening Theodore had spent in longer than he could readily account for. Mae asked him about his farm, about the cattle, about whether he was going to plant winter wheat or let the south field lie fallow this year. She asked with genuine interest, and she had opinions of her own, clear, practical opinions arrived at from her own experience of working her land, and she did not deliver them the way some people deliver opinions, as pronouncements requiring agreement, but as contributions to a conversation where disagreement was acceptable. He told her he was thinking of letting the south field rest because the soil had been pushing less each year and he thought it needed a season. She said that was probably right and that her north field had been the same way and she had left it fallow 2 years running and the 3rd year it had come back like it meant business. Like it was proving a point, she said. "What point?" he asked. "That it was not done," she said. "Just tired." He looked at her across the table. The firelight made her face warm and the shadows gathered softly at the edges of the room. He thought about fields that were not done, just tired, and felt this was about more than agriculture. "How is your father?" he asked. "Comfortable," she said, with the equanimity of someone who has made peace with a difficult situation. "He has better days and worse days. He was asking about you actually just this week. He wanted to know where you had gotten to. He is a good man, your father." "He is a very good man," she said simply, and there was a depth to the simplicity that told him everything about what Mae Fairchild carried. After supper, they sat with their coffee and Theodore brought out the preserved peaches in 2 bowls, and she ate them with the measured appreciation of someone who knew peaches in October were a luxury. They talked about the winter coming, about the town, about a new family that had come to settle 3 miles north of Clearwater in September, the Birch family out of Missouri with 4 children and a tremendous number of chickens. "Mrs. Birch came to introduce herself the week they arrived," Mae said. She brought a pie. It was an excellent pie. I think she is going to be good for this town." "What kind of pie?" Theodore asked. "Apple," Mae said, "with nutmeg." "I am not entirely sure how she managed nutmeg in a wagon, but I respect it deeply." He laughed. He had not laughed much in the past month, and it felt good, felt like the particular relief of a muscle that has been held tense finally letting go. Mae smiled at his laugh the way people smile when they have said something that caused laughter and were not entirely expecting it, a smile with a little surprise in it. They sat there until the fire had burned down twice, and he had fed it twice, and the night had gone well and truly dark outside the window. Mae looked at the window and then at her watch, the small silver one on a chain at her collar that had been her mother's. "I should go back," she said. "I like to look in on my father before I sleep." "Of course," he said. He walked her to the door and out into the cold night and across the yard to the fence gate he had fixed, holding the lamp to light her way. At the gate she turned and looked at him in the lamplight and said, "Thank you for supper, Theodore. The potatoes were good." "The cornbread was better," he said. "Everything is better with cornbread," she said. "That is a universal truth." "I will not argue with a universal truth," he said. She was smiling still, that smile that had a little surprise in it. He wanted very much to say something, to find the words that would tell her with appropriate clarity that Friday evening in his kitchen had been the finest evening he could remember, and that she was someone he would like to see in that kitchen again, and again after that, but the words were not quite there in the right arrangement. "Good night, Theodore," she said. "Good night, Mae," he said. She went through the gate and across the dark field toward her farmhouse, which had a light burning in one window, her father's room. He realized, left lit so she could find her way back. He stood at the gate watching that light and thinking about it, about a woman who left a light on for herself because there was no one else to do it. He went back inside and banked the fire and went to bed and lay there looking at the ceiling for a long time before he slept. November came in cold and purposeful, the way November in Kansas comes, with gray skies and a wind off the plains that cut straight through any illusions you might have had about autumn persisting. Theodore came over to Mae's farm on a Tuesday because he had noticed from his fence line that one of her barn doors was hanging badly from its upper hinge, and a hanging barn door in the approach of winter was a problem. He had his tools with him, and he was not pretending to need anything from her. Garrett, her hired man, was there that day and watched Theodore work on the barn door with an expression that was not unfriendly but was assessing. Garrett was a sturdy, quiet man of about 40 who had worked for the Fairchild family for 8 years, and who had, Theodore sensed, a protective regard for Mae that was entirely decent and paternal and also entirely serious. "Hinge was bad all summer," Garrett said after watching Theodore work for a few minutes. "I kept meaning to get to it." "There is always something," Theodore said. "Always is," Garrett said, and then after another pause, "She works harder than she should, has done since Mrs. Fairchild died." Theodore kept his eyes on the hinge. "I know it. She does not complain," Garrett said. "So if you are waiting for her to tell you she needs things, you will wait a long time." Theodore looked at him then. Garrett met his gaze with the steady, measuring quality of a man who has said exactly what he meant and is waiting to see what happens next. "I am not waiting," Theodore said. "I am trying to pay attention." Garrett considered this for a moment and then gave a small nod and went back to his work and said nothing further on the subject. Theodore fixed the barn door. Mae came out of the house while he was finishing, saw what he had done and said, "You did not have to do that." "I know I did not have to," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with her direct brown eyes. He looked back. The November wind moved through the dry grass around the barn. "I have coffee on," she said. It became a pattern, not a deliberate pattern, or perhaps a deliberate pattern that neither of them named as such. He came over on Tuesdays to help with whatever needed doing that was beyond Mae's available time or Garrett's 3-day schedule. She came through the gate on Friday evenings for supper. Sometimes she brought cornbread, and sometimes she brought a pie or a pot of something she said she had made too much of, and sometimes she came empty-handed because they had both stopped pretending the food was the reason she came. On the third Friday of November, while they were washing dishes after supper, she had started staying to help clean up, which had happened naturally, the way things that are natural tend to happen. Theodore told her about his father. His father, James Keating, had died when Theodore was 17, thrown from a horse during a late spring storm, and his mother had died when Theodore was 20, from a chest illness that had taken her quickly the way those illnesses sometimes did. He had run the farm alone for 6 years. He did not usually talk about this, not from pain, but from the same private quality that keeps most people from displaying the things that cost them most. But he told me, and she listened the way she did everything completely, without manufacturing responses while he was still speaking, just hearing it. "Do you get lonely?" she asked. "I thought I did not," he said. "I thought I was used to it. Then I went away for a month and came back and he stopped." "You what?" she said. "I came back and I realized there was something here I had not been paying attention to," he said. He did not look at her when he said it. He was looking at the dish he was drying. Mae was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I wondered about that." He looked at her then. "I thought," she said, "when you rode off, I thought, he is going somewhere to find something that is. I thought it was perhaps not so far away as he thought." She was not entirely comfortable saying it, and he found her discomfort made him feel tender toward her rather than uncertain, because it told him she was being honest about something that cost her something. "Me," he said, and he set down the dish. "Theodore," she said, and then smiled in that way she had with the surprise in it. "We are both very bad at this, I think. I rode through 6 counties," he said, "to find something that was on the other side of my fence the entire time." She looked at him steadily for a moment. The fire was burning behind him, and the kitchen was warm, and the November wind was outside the window doing what November wind does. Then she said, "That was very far to ride." "Yes," he said. "And yet here you are," she said. "Here I am," he said. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Her hand was warm from the dishwater and capable and strong, and she let him hold it, and they stood there in the fire-lit kitchen for a moment that had the quality of something shifting into place. He did not kiss her that night. He thought about it and decided that Mae Fairchild was not someone you rushed, and also that he was not someone who rushed things, or at least had decided to stop being someone who rushed things in the direction of the wrong things, and that this particular thing deserved to be done with care. But he held her hand, and she did not take it back, and when she left that night and walked across the dark field with the lamp he held for her, she turned at the gate and looked back at him with an expression that was warmer than her usual direct, unadorned look, and that he carried to bed with him like something valuable. December came, and with it the first real snow of the season, a genuine Kansas snow that dropped 14 inches in 2 days and turned the plains into a white silence. Theodore dug out the path between his house and the fence gate, and then dug out the path on Mae's side as well, because her path was longer and he had the energy. She appeared while he was finishing and leaned against the fence post with her arms crossed against the cold and watched him for a moment. "You dug my path," she said. "It needed doing," he said, sounding more like her than himself, and she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh properly, a real laugh, not just the polite acknowledgement of something amusing, but a laugh that came from somewhere genuine, and the sound of it did something to his chest that he was not prepared for in a very good way. "Come inside," she said. "I have been baking." He left his shovel in the snow and followed her into her farmhouse, which was warm in the way of a house that has been well managed for warmth, good fires, gaps properly caulked, curtains heavy enough to hold the cold back. It was tidier than his house and had more things on the walls, including a sampler her mother had made and a small drawing that he thought might be Mae's own work, a pencil sketch of the river in summer. "Did you draw that?" he asked. "Years ago," she said. "I used to draw more. There is not always time." He looked at the drawing. It was good, genuinely good, done with the same quality of looking that she brought to everything, seeing what was actually there. Josiah Fairchild was having a good day and had made it from his room to the chair by the kitchen fire, wrapped in a heavy quilt, looking frail but alert and pleased to have a visitor. He was a tall man gone thin with illness, with white hair and the same brown eyes as his daughter but a little more guarded in their looking. "Theodore Keating," he said. "Me told me you were back. Sit down." Theodore sat. Me busied herself with the baking, which turned out to be gingerbread, the smell of which was making the kitchen feel like the best place in the world. "Your father would be glad you kept the farm," Josiah said. "He was proud of that land." "Yes, sir," Theodore said. "Me keeps ours running," Josiah said, with a mixture of pride and the specific sorrow of a man who sees what is required of his daughter and wishes it were otherwise. "She keeps everything running. Been that way since Eleanor died." "She is very capable," Theodore said carefully. "She is more than capable," Josiah said. "She deserves someone who knows it." He was looking at Theodore with the frankness of a man who had been ill long enough to feel he had earned the right to say what he thought directly. "Do you know it?" "Yes, sir," Theodore said. "I believe I am beginning to." Josiah held his gaze for a moment, then gave a short nod and reached for his coffee cup and said no more on the subject. Me at the stove had her back to them both, and Theodore could not tell whether she had heard, and if she had heard what she thought about it. The gingerbread was, as it turned out, extraordinary. They ate it at the kitchen table with coffee while the snow pressed its white silence against the windows and Josiah dozed in his chair by the fire, and they talked about Christmas time in Kansas and what it had been like when they were children and whether it had been different. "When my mother was alive," me said, "she made a Christmas that was, she had a gift for it. She could take almost nothing and make it feel like everything." "What do you remember best?" he asked. Me thought about it. "The smell of the candles," she said. "We always had real candles at Christmas, the good ones, and she would sing." She paused. "That was probably where I got it from, the singing." "I have heard you sing," he said, "through the fence." She looked at him with mild surprise. "How much have you heard?" "Enough to know you are good at it and that you know most of the words to most of the hymns, but occasionally invent your own for the ones you have forgotten." She covered her face with her hands, laughing. "Those are the worst ones to overhear." "They are actually the best ones to overhear," he said. She lowered her hands and looked at him, and the laughter had not quite left her face yet, and the fire was warm behind her, and the snow was white outside, and Theodore Keating thought, "Here. This. This is what I went looking for, and it was here the entire time." He reached across the table and tucked the loose strand of hair behind her ear, carefully, the way you touch something you do not want to disturb. She went still. Her eyes met his. He leaned across the table and he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, brief and certain, and when he drew back she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her before, not the direct practical look, not the warm with laughter look, but something new and open, a kind of softness that her face did not usually wear but that suited it extraordinarily well. "Theodore," she said softly. "Me," he said. Josiah snored gently by the fire. The snow fell outside. The gingerbread sat between them on the table and the candle guttered once in a draught from the window and steadied. "That was a long time coming," me said. "I should have done it years ago," he said. "Yes," she said, "you absolutely should have." And then she was smiling again and he was smiling back, and it felt like something opening, a door swinging wide into somewhere warm. Winter deepened and their courtship deepened with it. He came to supper at her farm now as often as she came to his, and these evenings with Josiah at the table were some of the best Theodore had known. The old man had a dry humor and decades of story, and on his good days he told them about the early days of settlement, about the Kansas that existed before Clearwater was Clearwater, and Theodore and me would sit across the table from each other listening, occasionally catching each other's eyes, occasionally reaching across the corner of the table to let their hands find each other the way their hands had started doing when they were near each other, quietly, like something that knew its way home. By January, Theodore had kissed Mae Fairchild more times than he could count, which was a wonderful state of affairs, and she had kissed him back with a warmth that erased any remaining doubt. he might have carried about whether she had any interest in him. She was not demonstrative in the dramatic sense. She did not throw her arms around him or press herself against him in any improper way, but she was affectionate in a quieter, more consistent way that he found he loved more than the dramatic version would have been. A hand on his arm when she laughed, a shoulder leaned briefly against his when they sat together, a kiss given quickly, and then her eyes meeting his with that warm directness. He had started talking to Josiah on Tuesday afternoons when he was helping around the farm, about more than farm matters. Josiah was a man who had built something from nothing and watched it be partially disassembled by time and illness, and his perspective on what mattered and what did not had been clarified by that process into something sharp and useful. Theodore found himself telling Josiah things he had not told anyone, about what it had been like to lose both parents by 20, about the loneliness he had refused to name as such, about the 6 counties, and what had driven him to take that particular kind of hopeful, foolish ride. Josiah listened and then said, "You rode all that way looking for company you did not need to ride for." "Yes, sir," Theodore said. "Well," Josiah said, "the fact that you rode at all suggests something, that you wanted it. Some men never admit they want it." "I was not admitting it," Theodore said. "I was redirecting it incorrectly." "That is what young men do," Josiah said. February was a hard month that year, cold and relentless, and Mae was stretched thin between the farm and her father, whose health dipped in the deep cold and required more tending. Theodore took on more of the farm work without being asked, coming over every day rather than just Tuesdays, doing what needed doing and bringing firewood from his considerable store because Mae's was running lower than he liked. Garrett helped when he could. Mae did not argue about any of it, which told him she was tired in a way that went below tired. One evening in the middle of February when Josiah was having a hard night, and Mae was worn down to something quiet and small, she came through the gate to his kitchen not for supper, but just to sit, and she sat at his kitchen table and put her head down on her folded arms, and he understood that she was not quite crying but was very close to it. He put a pot of coffee on and sat beside her and put his hand on her shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing particular to say and she did not need him to say anything. She needed him to be there. He was there. He was there for the next hour while the coffee got warm and the fire burned steadily and outside the February wind made its February claims on the world. She sat up eventually and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said, "He is not going to get better." "I know," he said. "He has better days and I let myself think, but I know." "You have been wonderful to him," Theodore said. "He is my father," she said simply, as if this explained everything, and it did. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and they sat there together in the quiet kitchen, and he felt the exact dimensions of what they were to each other and thought that this specific thing, the sitting together when things were hard, was what he had not known he was looking for, because it was not the thing you thought to name when you were young and imagining what you wanted. You imagined the warmth and the laughter and the kiss across the table with the gingerbread between you. You did not necessarily imagine the February night when nothing was easy, and the best thing you had to offer was the fact of your presence. But it was the more important thing, and knowing that Mae Fairchild was the person he wanted to be present with and present for made everything clear in a way that nothing else had. "Mae," he said, into her hair, she said. "When the time is right," he said, "I would like to ask your father for your hand." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her breathing. "The time will be right soon," she said. "He will want to see me settled before." She stopped. "He worries about me." "He does not need to," Theodore said. "No," she said. "He does not." She tilted her head to look up at him and her eyes were clear and warm. "Ask him soon, Theodore. He would like that." He asked Josiah the following Tuesday afternoon while Mae was in town at the dry goods store. He asked plainly and directly, the way he did everything now, telling Josiah that he loved Mae and that he intended to spend his life making sure she had everything she deserved, and that he knew his farm was not the grandest thing in Kansas, but it was solid ground, and it would only get better with 2 people working it. Josiah looked at him for a long time with those guarded brown eyes. Then something in his face released, a tension that had been held so long it had become part of the landscape of him, and he put out his hand and Theodore shook it. "There is nothing in the world I want more," Josiah said, with a roughness in his voice that he did not try to clear, "than to know she will have someone like you." Theodore had to look at the wall for a moment. "Take care of her," Josiah said. "Every day," Theodore said. He proposed to me that Friday evening after supper in the kitchen that had become the site of all their most important conversations. He did not have a ring, not yet. He planned to go to Wichita for a proper ring, and this was a conversation, not an event to be performed. He told her he loved her. He told her she was the finest person he had ever known, and that he had spent 4 weeks looking for something she had already taught him just by being his neighbor. He told her he wanted to marry her, and that he wanted to build something with her that was better than either of them could build alone. She listened to all of it with her direct, clear eyes going soft, and when he was done she reached across and took both his hands and said, "Yes, Theodore, yes, obviously yes. Obviously," he said. "You have been my favorite person for months," she said. "Did you not know that?" "I was not sure," he said. "I was not going to announce it," she said. "I have some dignity," he laughed. She laughed. He stood and she stood, and he pulled her into his arms and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and he felt her breathe deeply and settle, the specific settling of someone who has been carrying something alone for too long finally setting it down. They were married in April of 1883, in the church that doubled as a schoolhouse, on a day when the Kansas prairie was doing what it occasionally does in April, which is to say it was trying very earnestly to be beautiful. The cottonwood trees along the river were putting out their first green. The grass was new and bright. The sky was the specific blue that only exists in Kansas in April, a blue so clear it seems like something earned. Josiah Fairchild attended the wedding in a chair brought from the front row, wrapped in his good quilt, looking frail but gloriously pleased. He had been having a good week, as if he had negotiated with his health for enough time to see this particular thing, and he sat in the front row with his daughter coming down the aisle toward him and Theodore, and the expression on his face was something Theodore would remember for the rest of his life. Mae wore her mother's dress, altered carefully to fit her, cream-colored with small pearl buttons down the front that had taken her 3 evenings to sew back on because the buttonholes had needed reinforcing. She wore her hair up but with that characteristic looseness at the edges, the strand that escaped behind her right ear, and she walked down the short aisle of the church with her eyes on Theodore, and Theodore looked back at her and thought he had never in his life seen anything so right. The minister, a steady man named Reverend Tate, who had been in Clearwater since its earliest days, and had a gift for saying things that mattered briefly rather than things that mattered only superficially at length, married them in 20 minutes. Theodore said his vows clearly, and meant every word of them in a way that surprised him only in how unsurprising it felt, like saying something he had known for a long time and was finally being asked to say aloud. Mae said hers in that straight, quiet voice, looking at him steadily, and he knew she meant them in the same complete way. When he kissed her in the church, she tasted like the peppermint she had been nervously eating that morning, which he knew because she had confessed to it, and the congregation, 40 or so people, most of Clearwater, Mrs. Cade and Mrs. Halbrook and old Pete Hollies and Garrett and the new Birch family with their tremendous number of children and their mother who had brought nutmeg across the plains, gave the kind of cheer that a small community gives when it approves of what is happening, which is a warm and genuine sound. Josiah shook Theodore's hand at the door of the church and held it a moment longer than a handshake requires. His grip was not strong, but it was firm, and Theodore held it, and they looked at each other and understood each other completely. They had a wedding supper at the farm, at the larger Fairchild kitchen table which could accommodate more people than Theodore's, and Mrs. Birch brought 2 pies including one that had actual nutmeg in it, and remained a subject of impressed commentary. Old Pete Hollies brought a fiddle and played it badly, but enthusiastically, and several people danced in the yard in the April sunshine, including me, who danced with her husband in the dry grass between the two farmhouses while Josiah watched from his chair on the porch with his face arranged in an expression of complete contentment. The next morning, the morning after their wedding night, which Theodore would say nothing about except that it was as warm and honest as me herself, and that it was the best night of his life, they went to have breakfast with Josiah, and the old man was sitting up and eating his eggs himself, which he had not done in a week. "You are looking well, sir," Theodore said. "I am feeling it," Josiah said. "Good to have you for a son." "Good to be one," Theodore said. Me, coming in from the kitchen with the coffee pot, caught this exchange and went briefly quiet and then brought the coffee and sat down, and they had breakfast together in the April morning, and it was one of those unremarkable mornings that the mind insists on keeping forever precisely because of how unremarkably good they were. They combined the two farms. It made immediate practical sense, and they both knew it: 2 sets of fields, 2 barns, 2 households. They moved Theodore's things into the Fairchild farmhouse, because it was larger and had Josiah in it, who needed to be near me, and they set about making the house theirs together, which involved several conversations about which of his things to keep and which were simply objects that had accumulated in a house without a woman's participation, and that now could be gratefully retired. "This chair," me said, looking at a particular armchair Theodore had brought over that had been in his parents' house. "That was my father's chair," he said. "Then it stays," she said immediately. "Obviously, I just wanted to know." "You can ask about all of it," he said. "Some of it should go." "I will not throw anything away that matters," she said. "How will you know what matters?" "I will ask you," she said, "or I will be able to tell." She was mostly right about being able to tell. The few times she could not, she asked, and he told her. His mother's plates, which he brought over, and she added to the kitchen dresser alongside her own mother's china. A small watercolor his mother had painted of the river, which he was surprised to realize he had never hung because he had always meant to and never gotten around to it, and which me hung in the parlor in a spot that was exactly right. Summer came in hot and bright, and they worked their combined land together, which was a genuine revelation in terms of what 2 people working toward the same end can accomplish. Me knew things about farming that Theodore had not thought to know, approaches to the land that her father had taught her that were different from what Theodore had learned, and they found a rhythm together in the fields that was satisfying in the deep way that good work shared with someone you love is satisfying. A satisfaction that gets into your bones and your hands and the smell of your skin at the end of the day. In July, Josiah had a week of very bad days, the worst he had had. Theodore stayed close to the house and me barely left it. Garrett came every day. On a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of July, while me was sitting with her father and Theodore was in the garden pulling weeds within earshot in case she called, Josiah Fairchild died peacefully, with his daughter holding his hand. Theodore heard the quiet in the house change quality, and he came in through the back door and found me sitting beside her father's bed with his hand in both of hers and her eyes very bright and dry. He crossed the room and knelt beside her and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him and finally, quietly, wept. They buried Josiah Fairchild in the Clearwater churchyard on a Saturday, next to his wife Eleanor, and the whole town came because in a small town the whole town comes, and because Josiah had been a good man who had done right by his community. Reverend Tate spoke well about him. Me stood beside Theodore through the service with her hand in his and her face steady and pale, and afterward she stood at the graveside while people came to offer their condolences, and she accepted each person's words with grace and gratitude, because she had been raised by people who believed in doing things gracefully, and she was her parents' daughter. In the evening, after everyone had gone, she went out to the fence line that divided what had been her father's land from what had been Theodore's, and stood there in the July dusk looking out across both farms that were now one farm, and Theodore went and stood beside her. He knew we would be all right, she said. Yes, Theodore said. That was what he wanted, she said. He told me once after Mother died that the only thing that would make losing her bearable was knowing I would not be alone. He was afraid all those years that I was going to be stubborn and independent and end up alone. You are stubborn and independent, Theodore said. Yes, she said, but I am not alone. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they looked out across the land in the dusk, the land that was theirs, and the summer evening held them in its warm dark. She cried some more in the weeks after Josiah's death, in private mostly, in the way of people who feel their grief is their own business, but occasionally in front of Theodore, and he was glad she had stopped treating it as something to be private about in his presence. He held her when she needed holding, and left her alone when she needed that, and brought her tea, and understood that neither tea nor holding fixed anything, but that both were worth offering. By August, she was talking about her father with the warmth that grief can eventually allow when you have passed through the worst of its initial weight, remembering the funny things and the particular qualities that made him himself. She told Theodore stories he had not heard about Josiah as a young man, before the farm, before Kansas, when he had been a cooper's apprentice in Ohio who had looked at a map of the territories and decided he was going to see what was west. He went looking for something, Theodore said. Didn't he? Me said with a small smile. It is apparently a thing people do, he said, and what they find, she said, is rarely what they went looking for. No, he said. But sometimes it is better. She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, and then returned her attention to the corn bread she was making, because she was always doing two things at once, and one of them was almost always corn bread. And Theodore sat at the kitchen table in the warm evening with his coffee, and the comfortable weight of happiness settled around him, and thought that he was a man who had everything he needed. September brought the harvest, and with it a kind of abundance that rewarded the summer's work. Theodore's winter wheat had come in well, and the south field, the one he had let rest the year before, had indeed come back strong and insistent, like a field with a point to prove. Mae's corn was excellent, and her kitchen garden had been so productive all summer that she had put up more jars of preserved vegetables than two people could reasonably consume in a winter, which she said was fine because they could give some to the Birch family who had now been in Clearwater a full year and whose children were, she maintained, eating everything their parents produced almost as fast as it was produced. The Birch family had become genuine friends. Ruth Birch, the matriarch with the legendary nutmeg supply, was a warm and practical woman of 35 who had taken a strong liking to me, and who came over to help with the canning in September in exchange for Mae's recipe for the corn bread, which Ruth correctly assessed was better than her own. Her husband David Birch was a steady, quiet man who got along well with Theodore in the way that steady, quiet men sometimes get along, which is to say they worked well alongside each other without needing to fill all the available silence. One September afternoon, while Ruth was at the table and Mae was at the stove, and the kitchen was full of steam from the canning and the warm smell of preserved tomatoes, Ruth said, with the directness of a woman who said what she thought, "Mae, I have to say, you and Theodore are the best matched couple I have seen in a long time." Mae glanced at Theodore, who was in the doorway having apparently come in for water. He had heard. "We had a head start," Mae said. "We spent 15 years being neighbors first." "Did you know him all that time?" Ruth asked. "Yes and no," Mae said. "I knew him the way you know the weather, present and occasionally useful and not entirely examined." Theodore in the doorway said, "That is possibly the least romantic description of me I have ever heard." "I was not finished," Mae said, "and then something shifted and I examined him properly and found there was a great deal more to him than I had assumed." "Is that better?" he said. "Much better," she said. "Go get your water." Ruth was laughing. Mae was not quite smiling, but her eyes were warm, and Theodore got his water and went back out to the harvest, and felt that being described as a great deal more than assumed was, in the end, a compliment worth the circuitous route to it. October came. and with it the first anniversary of the evening. He had come back to Clearwater with trail dust on his boots, and Mae had emerged from the dry goods store with a falling bolt of calico and had looked at him and told him he looked terrible. He had bought a ring in Wichita back in March, before the wedding, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, chosen because the garnet was dark red, and reminded him of the calico that had fallen on that October evening and started everything, or more precisely, had started the part of everything that he could see and name. He had given it to her on their wedding day, and she wore it always, this ring, even when doing the kind of farm work that required her to take off her gloves, tucking it carefully into her apron pocket, and replacing it when the rough work was done. He took her to the dry goods store on the anniversary of that evening, the 1st of October, 1883, not for any particular errand, but because he wanted to stand on that porch with her and remember it. They stood on the porch of the dry goods store in the October dusk, and Mae leaned against his arm and looked down at the porch steps where the calico had unrolled itself into the dirt. "I was embarrassed," she said. "You did not look embarrassed," he said. "You looked annoyed." "I was both," she said, "mostly at myself for the undignified landing." "I thought you were wonderful," he said. She looked up at him. "You thought I was a neighbor who had dropped her parcels." "Both things can be true," he said. She smiled and turned her face to the street, looking at the familiar shapes of Clearwater in the October evening, the blacksmith's forge with its glow, the saloon's yellow light, the church at the end of the street white against the darkening sky. A dog trotted past. A family in a wagon came through from the north, the Birch family's newest neighbors, settlers who had arrived in August. Life in Clearwater had been acquiring new people steadily, the town filling itself in like a drawing being completed. "I am glad you came home that night," Mae said. "I am glad I did too," he said. "I almost stopped in Wichita to spend the night." "Then the calico would have still been in one piece," she said. "And we might have spent another winter being only neighbors," he said. She turned and looked at him with those brown eyes that had been reading the world clearly and completely for as long as he had known her, and said, "I do not think that could have lasted very much longer, Theodore. I was already running out of ways to be only a neighbor." "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean," she said, "that when you rode away that September, I stood at the fence for a long time watching the road you went down. I did not tell myself why, but I knew why." He looked at her in the gathering October dark and felt something loosen in him that he had not even known was still tight, the last residue of wondering whether any of this had been mutual from its beginning. "Why?" he said. "Because," she said simply, "I had been in love with you for at least a year before you thought to look." He had no response to this that was adequate, so he kissed her instead, on the porch of the dry goods store in the October dusk. And Mrs. Cade, who had been watching through the window because she watched everything through the window, was heard to say to no one in particular, "It is about time." November of 1883, one full year after the fence had been mended and the first Friday supper had been eaten, Mae came to Theodore one evening and sat down across from him at the kitchen table and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her face. It was not troubled. It was the face she wore when she was sitting with a piece of information that she had been examining from multiple angles. "All right," he said. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He sat very still for a moment. Then he stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her face in his hands and looked at her, and she was smiling at him with that full, surprised smile, the real one, the one he had first seen at the fence line in the October sunlight. And he thought that his heart was going to be genuinely incapable of containing what it was currently being asked to contain. "Me," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you?" He stopped. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said. "And very well, both at once." He kissed her and held her, and she pressed her face against his chest, and he held her with the care of a man who is newly and sharply aware of the value of what he is holding. And they stood in the kitchen in the November evening, while the fire burned warm behind them, and the life they were building together took on a new dimension that opened forward into the future like the prairie opening, beyond the last line of fence. Winter passed warmly in the way that winters pass, when there is new life being anticipated within the house. Mae was capable and practical about her pregnancy, the way she was capable and practical about everything. Doing what needed doing and resting when she needed to rest, and occasionally startling Theodore by appearing to be doing something entirely inadvisable on a ladder before he could get there to suggest she might not need to be on a ladder just now. She would look at him from the ladder with those clear brown eyes and say she was fine and come down anyway, not because she conceded the point but because she had decided to, which was how Mae Fairchild operated. Dr. Hawthorne, the physician in Wichita, came to Clearwater occasionally for those who could not make the trip to town, and Theodore had arranged for him to be available when the time came. Mae had also developed a friendship with a woman named Alice Connolly, who had been a midwife longer than most people had been alive, and who lived 3 miles east, and who Mae said she would trust above anyone with this particular matter. The spring came, and it came slowly that year, March hesitating into April with lingering cold snaps, but by the time the cottonwood trees were making their first green gestures, the prairie was beginning to warm. The baby was born in late April of 1884, a fine, loud, healthy boy, in the bedroom of the farmhouse with Alice Connolly present and Theodore in the kitchen, demonstrating that he was significantly less composed than me, who between contractions told him through the doorway to stop pacing before he wore a groove in the floor. When Alice Connolly came to the kitchen door and told him he could come in, Theodore Keating walked into that room and saw me in the bed with their son in her arms, and the look on her face was something he had no word for, not the direct practical look, not the warm with laughter look, not even the open soft look she sometimes wore in their most private moments, but something entirely new. A look that had only existed in this world for the past 40 minutes, and that he understood was made of depths he was only beginning to see. "Come meet him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was small and red and very decisively present in the way of new people who have just arrived in the world, with his mother's dark hair and a face that was still becoming itself. "What will we call him?" Theodore asked. They had talked about names but not settled on one, in the way of people who cannot quite commit to naming someone they have not met. Mae looked at their son and then at Theodore and said, "Josiah." Theodore looked at her. She met his eyes steadily with all that directness, and with something wet at the edges that she was not bothering to contain. "Josiah," he said. "Yes." "Josiah James Keating," she said, giving the baby both their fathers. "Is that right?" "That is exactly right," he said, and he did not try to contain what was at the edges of his own eyes either. Little Josiah James Keating grew with the confident velocity of all healthy children, becoming by summer a small person with opinions, and by fall a small person with opinions, and the specific capacity for delight that belongs to children who are thoroughly loved. He had his mother's eyes and his father's chin, and what appeared to be an entirely original quality of stubbornness that was probably an inheritance from both sides averaged together into something double strength. Mae nursed him and worked around him with the efficiency she brought to all things, and Theodore watched her mother, their son, with a wonder that did not diminish with repetition, the specific wonder of seeing someone you already thought remarkable reveal a new dimension of their capability. She was a natural mother in the way that she was a natural farmer, not because it was easy, but because she paid attention to what was in front of her and responded to it truly. Garrett, her hired man of so many years, held the baby one afternoon in the yard with the expression of a man who has not held a baby in some time and is surprised to find he remembers how, and afterward he shook Theodore's hand and said, "Good little boy." "He is," Theodore said. "She did good," Garrett said. "She does everything good," Theodore said. "Yes," said Garrett, with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose long-held assessment has been confirmed. Ruth Birch became Josiah's devoted honorary aunt, arriving regularly with things she had baked and with her own children, who treated the baby, with the mixture of excessive tenderness and inadvertent roughness that older children always bring to the vicinity of babies. Me managed the chaos with equanimity, and Theodore managed the parts of it that exceeded equanimity, and the farmhouse in the evenings was loud and warm and full of life in a way that it had not been during the quiet years. The farm grew. Theodore expanded the cattle herd in the spring of 1885, buying a dozen new head from a rancher in Barber County, passing through on the errand. Theodore rode through land he had ridden through in his futile search for Clara Voss, and thought about that with some amusement. The same roads, the same sky, but an entirely different man on a different kind of errand. Me developed her kitchen garden into something genuinely impressive that summer, adding a section of medicinal herbs at the suggestion of Alice Connolly, who had been teaching me what she knew about the practical medicine that a farm woman needed to know. Me learned with the focused intensity she brought to anything that interested her, and by the end of the summer she could identify and prepare more treatments for common ailments than she could have at the summer's start, which Theodore considered a useful development given that Clearwater was 20 miles from its nearest physician. On a quiet September evening in 1885, with Josiah asleep in his crib and the harvest in and the cattle settled, and the kitchen table between them carrying their coffee cups and the remains of a pie that Ruth Birch had left, Theodore looked at his wife across the table and thought about the route that had brought him here. He thought about the letter from Burl Dawson and the hopeful, foolish ride through 6 counties. He thought about the October evening at the dry goods store and the bolt of calico and the woman with flour on her cheek who had said she was glad he was home. He thought about the fence they had repaired together and the corn bread and the fire and the first Christmas and the February night when she had come to his kitchen not for supper, but just to sit and put her head down on her arms. He thought about Josiah Fairchild's handshake at the church door and about the wedding in April with the blue sky and the green cottonwoods. He thought about the fence line in the July dusk after the funeral and what Me had said about not being alone. He thought about the October evening on the porch of the dry goods store when she had told him she had been in love with him for at least a year before he thought to look. He had ridden through 6 counties, and all he had found was confirmation that what he wanted was not to be found in 6 counties. It had been here on the other side of his fence, tending its own farm and singing its own hymns and occasionally inventing the words it had forgotten. "What are you thinking about?" Me said. He looked at her across the table. She was reading, a habit she had resumed more regularly now that they had enough evening hours to sustain it, and she had looked up from her book with the slightly abstracted quality of someone who has pulled their attention from one world into another and is still bridging. "I was thinking about the ride," he said. "The 6 counties." She closed her book with her finger in it and looked at him. "I was thinking about how I went all that way looking for something," he said, "and I came home to find it. And I was thinking that I am the luckiest man in Kansas." She held his gaze for a moment with those brown eyes, and then she said, "You are not the luckiest man in Kansas." "No," he said. "No," she said, "but you are mine, which is better." He laughed, the warm, genuine laugh that she had first produced from him with the words "on the other side of my fence," and which she had been producing from him at regular intervals ever since. "That is better," he agreed. She went back to her book and he sat across from her with his coffee, and outside the September night was settling over the Kansas plains, and the cattle were quiet in the barn and their son was asleep in his crib, and the fire burned warm and steady in the kitchen. The 2 farms were one farm. The 2 houses were one house. The woman who had been his neighbor for 15 years was his wife of 2 years, and the mother of his son, and the person on whose other side of the fence he would spend the rest of his life. She turned a page in her book and the fire shifted, and the September wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the river, and Theodore Keating thought, "This is it. This is all of it. This is everything anyone goes looking for, and most people are too busy looking in the wrong direction to see." Time moved the way time moves on a farm, in the rhythms of seasons and harvests, and the growth of children, and the slow, ongoing work of building something that lasts. By the spring of 1887, little Josiah was 3 years old and conducting himself as if he were at minimum 7, having developed strong opinions about which animals were his friends and which were strangers deserving only of suspicion. His friend category included Cutter, Theodore's bay horse who had made the long ride through 6 counties and was now living a dignified, retired life in the barn. His suspicion category included the 3 geese that Mae had acquired from the Birch farm, which Josiah regarded as representatives of chaos, and which the geese appeared to regard as an entertainment. Mae was carrying their second child by that spring, expecting in August, and she was, if possible, more radiant in her second pregnancy than her first, which Theodore told her, and she told him to stop being ridiculous, and then smiled in a way that suggested she was not entirely displeased. They had by that spring made the farmhouse into something that was fully and unmistakably theirs. His mother's plates on the dresser and her watercolor on the parlor wall, Mae's mother's sampler in the hall, and the drawing Mae had made of the river beside it. A new braided rug in the kitchen that they had made together over the winter from wool strips, and which was not entirely even but was warm and colorful and entirely theirs. 2 rocking chairs on the front porch that Theodore had made himself over 2 winters from good hard oak. A kitchen garden that was the envy of every woman in Clearwater, and possibly a radius beyond. Garrett had retired in the winter of 1886, his knee finally requiring more rest than the work allowed. He had gone to live with his daughter's family in Wichita, and before he left, he had shaken Theodore's hand very formally and told him to take good care of the land, which Theodore understood meant both the land and the woman who had tended it longest. Theodore told him he would and meant it, and Mae had packed Garrett enough food for 3 days of traveling and held his hands when she said goodbye, and told him he had been one of the best parts of her life for a very long time. They hired a young man named Tom Birch, yes, one of David and Ruth's boys, the eldest, who was 18 and sturdy and eager, and who had grown up watching Mae Fairchild Keating run a farm and had a healthy respect for both her knowledge and her standards. He was good with the cattle and reliable, and Mae taught him the things Garrett had taught her, passing the knowledge forward. In August of 1887, their second child arrived, a boy again, healthy and loud, with Theodore's brown hair and Mae's stubborn chin. They named him Henry, after no one in particular, but because Mae said it was a name that stood on its own and did not need explaining, which seemed right for a person who had already demonstrated within his first hour of existence that he was going to stand on his own and not need much explaining either. Josiah, now 3, inspected his brother with the gravity of someone conducting an important assessment. He spent a few minutes in silent examination, and then announced that the baby was acceptable and went back to his other concerns. Mae caught Theodore's eye over Josiah's head, and they both managed, barely, to contain their laughter. The winter of 1887 was cold and long but not cruel, and they spent it the way they had spent all their winters since the first one, close to home, close to the fire, close to each other. Mae read and drew and sewed and made bread and managed 2 small boys and the household with the same focused, capable energy she brought to everything. Theodore mended tools and tended the animals and read when Mae handed him books she had finished, which she did with recommendations that were always right, and spent evenings at the kitchen table with his wife while the children slept and the fire burned, and the Kansas winter did its work outside and failed to penetrate. They talked endlessly in the way of 2 people who genuinely liked each other's company and had found in their marriage not the end of conversation, but the beginning of more of it. They talked about the farm and the children and the town's news and the larger world that reached them through the Wichita paper and the conversations of people passing through. They talked about their parents, about the pieces of themselves that came from those people and the pieces they had built themselves. They talked about what they wanted for Josiah and Henry, What they hoped to give them, not riches, because they did not have riches, but the specific inheritance that consists of watching two people love each other honestly and work their lives together with dignity. By 1888, Theodore and Mae Keating had been married 5 years, and Clearwater had grown, steadily if not spectacularly, into a proper small town. The church had been expanded. There was now a second dry goods store, and a doctor who came twice a month from Wichita. A one-room schoolhouse had been built, a proper one, not the church doubling anymore, and young Josiah was old enough that the question of his schooling was becoming something to prepare for, which Mae was preparing for with the thoroughness she brought to preparation. She wanted both boys to be educated, truly educated, and she had opinions about what that meant that she had been developing and articulating since before they were born. She wanted them to be able to read well and to understand numbers and to know something of the world beyond the farm, while also knowing everything about the farm, because a man who understood his land was a man who could always stand on something solid. Theodore listened to her talk about this and contributed his own thoughts, which were largely in agreement with hers, and thought about Josiah Fairchild telling him that Mae worked harder than she should, and that she deserved someone who knew it. He knew it every day, with more depth and detail as the days accumulated into the substance of a life. One spring morning in May of 1888, Theodore was out in the south field, the one that had rested and come back strong, that Mae had said came back like it was proving a point, mending a section of the outer fence. It was a good morning, warm with a light breeze, and the spring grass was bright green, and the cattle were out in the north pasture, and from somewhere across the farm he could hear Mae singing. She was singing one of the hymns, the real words, but at a particular moment he heard her transition without apparent consciousness into the invented version, the version she produced when she had forgotten the actual words, which he recognized because he had been listening to her sing over the fence line for going on 7 years now with the specific attention of someone who could not help it. He stopped mending the fence and stood in the May sunlight listening. He thought about the night he had ridden out of Caldwell under a black sky, believing that what he wanted was far away, and that he had to ride hard and fast to find it. He thought about all the counties, all the road, all the boarding houses and dry creek beds in wrong directions. He thought about coming home in the October dusk with nothing to show for it except exhaustion and the specific wisdom that only comes from being thoroughly wrong in a particular way. And then he thought about the evening he had come back and the dry goods store and the calico and the woman who had looked at him and said he looked terrible and then said she was glad he was home. He thought about everything that had followed, the fence and the corn bread and the fire and the snow and the proposal and the wedding and the years, these full and real and irreplaceable years. He picked up his tools and walked back across the south field toward the farmhouse, following the sound of Mae's voice. She was in the kitchen garden, working in the medicinal herb section that Alice Connolly had inspired her to develop, and she was singing to the plants the way she sang to everything when she thought no one was listening. And little Henry, almost 1 year old, was sitting on the blanket she had spread on the ground beside her, pulling at the grass with great concentration. She looked up when she heard Theodore's step and smiled at him. That smile, the one with the surprise in it that was no longer surprised exactly but had kept the quality of brightness, like a light that had been left on so long it had become the natural condition of the room. "I was listening to you sing," he said. "From the south field," she said. "You can hear you from the south field," he said. "You have always been audible from the south field." "Then you have been listening to me sing for years," she said. "Years," he agreed. She looked at him in that direct, clear way, and Henry on his blanket pulled up a substantial handful of grass and seemed very pleased about it, and the May sky was as blue as the April sky on their wedding day, and the prairie was green and wide and theirs. "Theodore Keating," Mae said, with a warmth in her voice that he felt from his boots to his collar, "you are looking at me like I am something remarkable. "You are something remarkable," he said. She made a dismissive sound that did not match her eyes. "I am a farmer's wife pulling up weeds in a garden," she said. "You are the finest person I have ever known," he said. "And you are pulling up weeds in a garden, and both of those things are true at the same time." She was quiet for a moment. Henry offered her the handful of grass, and she accepted it gravely and thanked him, and Henry, satisfied, returned to his project. Josiah could be heard somewhere in the direction of the barn doing something that would probably require supervision in a few minutes. Mae looked at the grass in her hand, and then at her husband standing in her kitchen garden on a May morning in 1888 with his fence-mending tools and his good face and his 6 counties behind him and his whole life in front of him here on this land with her. "Well then," she said, "come here and I will put you to work." He laughed and set down his tools and went to her, and she handed him a trowel and pointed to the section of the garden that needed attention, and they worked side by side in the May sun, while Henry explored the boundaries of his blanket, and the farm spread around them in all directions, strong and good and growing. The years ahead were full ones. Josiah started school in the fall of 1888 and immediately distinguished himself as both the best reader in his class and the most likely to have an opinion about whatever was being discussed, 2 qualities that his mother received with pride and his teacher received with a mixture of appreciation and wariness. Henry walked his first steps that same October, unsteadily but with great determination, covering the length of the kitchen in a series of lunges that ended in his father's arms. Mae caught it all and held it all in her characteristic way completely, without adding what wasn't there, and without losing what was. Their 3rd child was born in the spring of 1890, a girl this time, with her father's brown hair and her mother's direct eyes, and an expression in those eyes from the very first days of her life that suggested she had arrived with opinions already formed. They named her Alina for Mae's mother, and Josiah, who was 6, treated his sister with the careful seriousness of someone who understood this was important, and Henry, who was 2.5, treated her with the reckless affection of a boy who loved everything loudly. Ruth Birch cried when she heard the name Alina. She had known Mae Fairchild and had told me so when they first became friends. She came to see the baby with a nutmeg-scented pie and held little Alina and said she had her grandmother's look about her, and Mae said she hoped so. Clearwater by 1890 was a real town, properly constituted, with a marshal and a post office and a school and 3 churches, and a population of several hundred. The Kansas prairie all around it was filling in with farms and ranches, and the railroad had come close enough that getting to Wichita was faster than it had been. The world was arriving at them steadily from the east, with its railroads and its telegraph lines, and its newspapers full of the late 19th century proceeding at its complicated pace. Injustices existed in the world around them that Theodore and Mae read about in those newspapers with troubled hearts. The treatment of the Indian peoples who had been pushed steadily from their lands, the violence that continued to move across the territories in the name of settlement, the way the expansion that had made their own farm possible had been built on the dispossession of others. These were not simple things, and they did not pretend they were. And they talked about them at the kitchen table the way they talked about everything, honestly and without easy resolution, because some things did not have easy resolution, and honesty required acknowledging it. What they could do, they did. They dealt fairly with every person who came to their farm. They taught their children to do the same. They were good neighbors, as their parents before them had been good neighbors, and in the small economy of a small community, this was both less than what was needed in the wider world and everything that could be done in the immediate one. The farm in the 1890s was a flourishing thing. The combined acreage, managed well for a decade, had become genuinely productive enough that Theodore could afford 2 full-time hired hands in the busy seasons, and that Mae could put money aside each year in the small tin box in the kitchen dresser that represented her own sense of security. a thing she had learned to value from the years of managing alone. Old Pete Hollies, the blacksmith who had gone gray at 22, finally got around to getting married in 1891 to a cheerful widow from Pratt County, and me and Theodore attended the wedding with all 3 children and felt the specific warm feeling of people who know what is beginning and are glad for it. And on the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in April of 1893, Theodore Keating and Mae Fairchild Keating sat on the front porch of their farmhouse in the 2 rocking chairs he had made, watching the April evening come down over the land that was theirs, while inside the house Josiah was reading at the kitchen table, and Henry was pretending to be asleep, and little Eleanor was deeply and genuinely asleep, 3 years old and already, as her grandmother had been. A person who could make a night feel like everything. The cottonwood trees along the river were in their first green. The sky was the April blue that only Kansas gets. The cattle were settled and the fields were ready for planting, and the kitchen was warm inside, and the sound of the river came to them faint and steady on the evening air. Mae had her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at the land with the same expression she had always brought to looking at things fully, directly, seeing what was there. She was 33 years old, and she was the most beautiful person Theodore had ever seen, and he told her so. "You have to say that," she said. "I do not have to say anything," he said. "I say it because it is true." She looked at him sidelong. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. "It went fast," she said, with a wonder in her voice that was not quite the same as sorrow but lived in the same neighborhood. "It did," he said, "but it was full." She reached across the gap between the rocking chairs and took his hand the way she had been taking his hand for 10 years, quietly, like something that knew its way. He held it the way he had been holding it for 10 years, with the care of someone who understood what he was holding. "Do you know what I have been thinking about today?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I have been thinking about the calico," she said. He smiled. "The bolt of calico. It unrolled so completely," she said, with the reminiscent quality of someone revisiting a memory that has become dear in retrospect. "I was so sure I had it balanced." "You were very close," he said. "I was not close at all," she said. "I was holding it completely wrong, and it was going to fall no matter what I did. And then it fell," he said, "and I happened to be there." "You happened to be there," she said, "after riding through 6 counties to find something that was 20 feet from your own front door." "The universe has a sense of humor," he said. "The universe," Mae said, "is more efficient than it seems." He looked at her profile against the April evening, the straight line of her nose and the curve of her mouth and the dark hair now pulled back more loosely than she used to wear it, a looseness she had stopped apologizing for some years ago. He looked at the hand that held his, the capable hand with the gold ring and the small garnet. He looked at the land stretching out before them, their land, which had been 2 farms and was now 1 farm and would someday be 3 when the children were grown and could decide what they wanted to do with it. He thought about all the miles he had ridden in the wrong direction and all the roads that had brought him back to the right one, and about how the thing you were looking for was very rarely where you thought it was and very often where you had not thought to look. He thought about fields that rested and came back strong. He thought about cornbread and the fence line and Josiah Fairchild's handshake, and the sound of singing coming across the grass from the other side of a fence on a morning when the world was ordinary and everything. "Me," he said. She looked at him. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since I came back that October, and I think I had been loving you for years before that without knowing what I was doing." She held his gaze with her whole steady self, and her eyes were warm with the warmth that had been there since the kitchen in November with the gingerbread between them and the fire burning behind them both. "I know," she said. "I have known for a long time." "I rode through 6 counties," he said. "You did," she said. "And you were right here," he said. "I was," she said. "Pulling my calico off the porch steps." "I am glad the bolt fell," he said. "Theodore," she said, squeezing his hand once firmly with everything she meant, "so am I." The April evening settled over the prairie, and the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, and the cottonwood trees made their soft sound along the river, and the farmhouse glowed warm behind them with its lights, and its sounds of children and the smell of the fire. Theodore Keating and Mae Fairchild Keating sat in their rocking chairs on the porch of their home in the middle of the Kansas prairie, hand in hand, watching the night come in, and neither of them needed to say another word because everything that needed to be said was already said, and everything that needed to be had was already theirs. The land was good. The children were sleeping. The river was running. The fire was burning. And on the other side of the fence that Theodore Keating had spent a cold November morning repairing while his neighbor brought him water in a bucket, the field that had been let to rest was green and growing, and exactly where it had always been, full of everything it had been waiting to become.